Good morning. I'm Helen Foss, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you as today's worship associate. Welcome to First Unitarian Church of Wilmington, Delaware. Welcome to all of you who are here in person in the sanctuary this morning, and welcome to those of you at home who are joining us online. Welcome to you all, no matter the hue of your skin or the origin of your ethnicity. Welcome to whomever you love and wherever you are on your spiritual journey. You are welcome here. If you're new to First Unitarian, I invite you to check out our website, firstuuwilm.org, to learn more about us and sign up for our email newsletter that would come to you every Friday in your inbox. This morning, we welcome Reverend Libby Smith back to our First Unitarian pulpit. Reverend Libby is a lifelong UU. There's not that many of us. Lifelong. She grew up in the York, Pennsylvania UU Church and was ordained 31 years ago in 1992. She has served both as a UU parish minister as well as a chaplain for 5 years at UU House. Now that she is retired from congregational work, she says that she sees her work as a part-time patchwork ministry, mostly guest preaching and rites of passage. And she enjoys having more time for her husband, her garden, and her cat. We're delighted to have you back once again, Reverend Libby. And now, let us prepare our hearts and minds for worship.
The words of our call to worship are from a colleague of mine who was a fellow student over 30 years ago. Thanks for reminding me how long it's been, Helen. The Reverend Amy Mackenzie Quinn. Welcome to this common, sacred space. Common because here we are all welcome. Sacred because here we transform the ordinary and attend to the profound. We carry with us our regrets, doubts, fears, stories, laughter. May they inspire our worship. Above all, may we each meet here what we need most find, here on this day, in this common, sacred space.
If you have a candle or chalice at home, I invite you to light it while Reverend Libby lights our chalice here in the sanctuary. As I read these words by Reverend Lindsay Bates, Lindsay Bates had a 40-year ministry with Unitarian Universalist Society of Geneva, Illinois, and is now minister emeritus there. She says, "To face the world's shadows, a chalice of light. To face the world's coldness, a chalice of warmth. To face the world's terrors, a chalice of courage. To face the world's turmoil, a chalice of peace. May its glow fill our spirits, our hearts, and our lives." Please stand now as you're willing and able to join in singing hymn 1000 in the Till hymnal, or the words will be on the front here. Morning has come.
Morning has come, arise and greet the day. Dance with joy and sing a song of gladness. The light of peace here shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home. A new day dawns, once more the gift is given. Wonder fills this moment shared together. The light of love's here shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home. Open our eyes to see that life abounds. Open hearts to welcome it among us. The light of love here shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home.
Please join me now in affirming our mission. First Unitarian Church of Wilmington is a beloved community that nourishes minds and spirits, fights injustice, and transforms the world through loving action.
Let's take a moment to quiet ourselves and spend a little time together in meditation and prayer. Spirit of life and love, source of our courage and our strength, you who we know by many names, and yet who is beyond our naming. We rejoice in the beauty of this day, the bright sun and blue sky, the possibilities and hopes and dreams that it brings. Despite our struggles and our imperfections, help us to celebrate the good in ourselves, in each other, and in the world we share. Help us to live as people worthy of that world. Teach us to protect it. Give us the strength to combat injustice, to speak truth to power, to bring love in place of fear and mistrust. We hold in our hearts today all those who need courage and care, here in this room, here in our local community, and in communities all around the world. Help us to care for each other, to hold each other in our joys and our sorrows, and to rejoice together in our times of celebration. And remind us to give thanks for the joys and blessings among us, those we recognize and those that sometimes go unnoticed. May we learn to be more aware of the beauty and grace that surround us. May we trust the power of love to strengthen us. May we live lives of love to strengthen others. May we live boldly into the promise of the world that we long for. As we continue this time of prayer and meditation, let us enter together into a time of silence. Each week as we gather, we take time to attend to the concerns of our own, our loved ones, or our world that we're holding in our hearts. So I want you to take a moment now to listen to what it is that you are holding in your heart. And if you wish to do so, you may speak those concerns aloud into this room, or if you're online, you can write them in the chat. I'll begin by letting you know that I know some of you have been worried about Vidya and Deborah Sagar, who live in Maui, and we're pleased to report that they are safe. They have not had property damage. So I'm sure their surroundings are still challenging, but they're okay, and just continue to hold them and the people of Hawaii in your hearts. May all those whose names were spoken and those unspoken but carried in our hearts find peace and healing this day. Amen.
There is a love
Singing that with you all left me wishing I had brought a different sermon. But I didn't, so we'll go on with the one I've got. Someday I'll come back and preach the other one. The reading this morning is from the book Rising Strong by Brené Brown. Some of you may be familiar with her work. She's a psychologist who has written a lot about vulnerability and courage and learning to get comfortable with those uncomfortable emotions that we so often have. She writes, "We've all fallen, and we all have the skinned knees and bruised hearts to prove it. But rarely do we see wounds that are in the process of healing. I'm not sure if it's because we feel too much shame to let anyone see a process as intimate as overcoming hurt, or if it's because even when we muster the courage to share our still incomplete self-healing, people reflexively look away. We much prefer stories about falling and rising to be inspirational and sanitized. We like recovery stories to move quickly through the dark so we can get to the sweeping redemptive ending. Don't get me wrong, I love and continue to champion the idea of understanding and accepting failure as part of any worthwhile endeavor. But embracing failure without acknowledging the real hurt and fear that it can cause, or the complex journey that underlies rising strong, is gold-plating grit. To strip failure of its real emotional consequences is to scrub the concepts of grit and resilience of the very qualities that make them both so important: toughness, doggedness, and perseverance." Brené Brown. So here we are on this beautiful summer morning, ready to talk about failure. It's everybody's favorite subject, right? We really want to be here together thinking about all the ways we have gotten it wrong throughout our lives. And if you are like me, there have been many. But I've been thinking lately about failure and about how hard it is sometimes to admit our failures. And while I'm focusing in on the personal this morning, I think the extension of this is really evident around us in our wider culture as well. How much courage it takes to look at where we go wrong, and why, and how we feel about it, and where we go from there. And as I look around me and as I look inside me, I see so much defensiveness and denial and bravado. No one likes to admit their failures. But as Brené Brown says, we've all fallen, and we all have the skinned knees and bruised hearts to prove it. Her book, Rising Strong, and this sermon are not just about failure, they're also about courage and resilience and persistence, about getting back up after you fall. But you don't need to get back up if you haven't fallen in the first place. I want to pause and acknowledge my debt this morning both to Brené Brown and to the Quaker activist and educator Parker Palmer, because both of them had a profound influence on this sermon, and I won't always even be able to identify where strands of thought have come from as I played around with all of it, so just know that this sermon could not have happened without their work. Personally, I don't like to look too closely at my own failures. And if you're like me, when you fail at something, large or small, you might prefer to move on from that fairly quickly, without a great deal of self-examination about what went wrong or how it felt. Just get it in the rear view and hope for better next time. Sermons are, for me, a really great example of this. It's easier now that I'm a guest preacher because I'm usually bringing something sort of tried and true. But even then, something that works beautifully in one context can fall completely flat in another context. But back in the day when I was cranking one out most weeks, some were better than others, and some weren't. Some things just seem better on paper than they do from the pulpit, or maybe they don't even seem good on paper, but you've run out of time. But once I preached it, it was over. Maybe I felt good about it, maybe I didn't, but it was over. I was never in the habit of doing much post-sermon analysis. I was not a Monday morning quarterback of preaching. I just wanted to put it behind me and get on to the next one. But you know when that doesn't work? When you preach for a congregation that has 2 services. When after you give a sermon and you realize that it really was pretty lousy, you know that in about a half an hour you're going to have to give it again. I had this experience, as you may be able to tell, a number of years ago when I was preaching for the Unitarian Society of Germantown. I had preached the 9 o'clock service and realized that the sermon just did not work. It didn't hold together. You can sometimes tell by the looks on people's faces that nothing you're saying is getting through. And I could tell it wasn't making sense, and I was trying to hold on to hope that it was better than I thought, but then I really knew for sure when people were excruciatingly polite to me after church. And I felt horrible, and I couldn't just leave and say, oh, well, at least it's over, because folks were starting to show up for the 11 o'clock. And I was going to have to preach the thing again, this time knowing ahead of time that I was wasting people's time because it wasn't any good. Now, as it turned out, my colleague Kent Mathias, who served USG at the time, happened to be in attendance that morning, although he was not preaching. And when we spoke between services and I expressed my disappointment in myself, fully expecting him to contradict me and reassure me that it had been fine, instead, he completely agreed with me. You are right, he said. You lost them in the middle of it. You really need to tighten it up. Hey, you've got 15 minutes. Use my office. I don't like revisiting sermons, but I used his office. And the sermon still wasn't great at 11. There's only so much you can do in 15 minutes. But it was a lot better than it had been at 9. It was only embarrassing and not humiliating. And it just took the gentle nudging of a colleague to give me the courage to look at why it hadn't worked. Kent had enough faith in me as a preacher to know that I could do better. And he gave me the faith in myself to do better. Okay, I had fallen down, metaphorically speaking, but I was able to pick myself up and keep going. So this whole sermon grows out of this universal experience of falling down and then figuring out how to find the courage and the resilience to get back up. We have a lot of expressions in our language about the value of perseverance. If at first you don't succeed, you've got to get right back up on that horse. Pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and start all over again. I remember my piano teacher when I was a kid telling me that it was much more impressive in a performance for a pianist to recover well from making a mistake than to play flawlessly. And haven't we all been amazed by those figure skaters when we watch the Olympics? The ones who totally wipe out on the ice and then are able to swoop themselves back into position and continue with their extraordinarily difficult routines while still smiling for the camera. We've all had, in one form or another, the experience of stumbling or falling and then having to either start over or keep going. But there's more to it than that. And this is what Brené's talking about and how we want our rising back up to be all sanitized. You know, we fall down and we get up and we forget that there's this time in between falling down and getting up. All those expressions I was just talking about, they don't reflect that time in the middle. They imply this seamless transition from falling down to rising strong. They don't mention that little detail of the time in between when you're flat on your face, often in front of other people. I mean, think about those Olympic skaters. They don't show it at the time. You see them flow almost effortlessly back into their routine as if nothing had gone wrong. But afterwards, there's always that heartbreaking shot where they're sitting next to their coach sobbing. It's a lot more complicated than just picking yourself up and dusting yourself off and starting over. To begin with, it takes a lot of courage, for me at least, simply to admit the failure in the first place, to admit it to myself, to admit it to others. Denial is such a wonderful coping mechanism. I go back to that morning in Germantown. If Kent hadn't been there, I probably would have tried to pretend that things had gone fine, slogged through the sermon one more time, and then gone home and taken a nap and tried to forget all about it. But because I had a colleague there who held me accountable, who gently held up a mirror to show me both my strengths and my weaknesses, I was able to admit that it wasn't good enough and try to do better. But once we admit that we failed, then it also takes courage to sit with the feelings that result from failing. That's why having only 15 minutes to work on that sermon was a real challenge, because I had to spend the first 5 of it just being disgusted with myself before I could move into the more productive phase of actually trying to work on what I had created. And this is a piece that Brené Brown talks a lot about in her book, Rising Strong. She encourages us to try to find ways to welcome those uncomfortable emotions, to get curious about them, to see what they have to teach us. And that's a very uncomfortable step, because it brings us face to face with things we would rather not feel, like embarrassment, shame, anger, disappointment, no one's favorite emotions. But Parker Palmer, in his little book, Let Your Life Speak, reminds us that we have to learn from our liabilities as well as our strengths. An inevitable, though often ignored dimension of the search for wholeness, he writes, is that we must embrace what we dislike or find shameful about ourselves, as well as what we are confident and proud of. I want to read that again. An inevitable, though often ignored dimension of the search for wholeness is that we must embrace what we dislike or find shameful about ourselves, as well as what we are confident and proud of. Most of us don't really want to look at those parts of ourselves or at the feelings that accompany our failures. We'd rather anesthetize ourselves, whether by having a drink or going shopping or watching mindless television or playing computer games. You can insert your own favorite escapist activities here. Instead, we have to be willing, as a therapist I know used to say, to shake hands with that feeling. She'd say, you're going to be living with that feeling for quite some time. You might as well try to make friends with it. Sometimes it takes more courage to sit with the feelings we have while we're down than it does to just jump right up and try again. But we're a lot more likely to do better when we jump up and try again if we spent a little time sitting with the feelings we've had while we're down. None of us enjoys those feelings of fear or shame or anger or sadness, but we can pay attention to them and learn from them, sit with them and not be consumed by them. We need to be able to say, yes, I failed, without having it turn into, therefore I am a failure in our own minds. We need to feel the messy emotions without letting them define us. So it takes courage to admit that we failed. It takes courage to sit with the feelings that result from failing. Then it also takes courage to explore the reasons why we may have failed. What really happened? What went wrong and why? Sometimes failure is actually rooted in some very admirable qualities. Brené Brown talks about daring greatly. This idea that when we take big risks, when we're deeply invested and passionate about something, we're willing to jump in wholeheartedly, take those big risks, and yet when you dare greatly, you know that when you take a lot of big risks, you're bound to have some flops along the way. But you're willing to just go in there, give it everything you have, and see what happens. Now, that is a brave kind of failure. It grows out of having the courage of our convictions, being willing to try no matter what. And the occasional face plant is inevitable when we take risks. It takes a lot of courage to put yourself out there in a big way. And sometimes you pour your heart into it, and it doesn't work, and then you have to figure out why and try again. So the grit to try big and fail big and figure out why and have the courage to get up and try again, that would make a great sermon. But that didn't actually ring true for me for much of my own experience. There are a lot of other reasons why we sometimes fail. A lot of my failures, it seems to me, have come from the opposite problem, because I didn't dare greatly enough. I was unwilling to be all in. I was half-hearted in my preparation and my planning. Some failures occur because we don't have the courage of our convictions, because we don't dare big enough. So I'm getting all abstract again, so I'll bring it back to the sermon example, because that's the one closest to home for me, where I most consistently experience both success and failure. You will have your own examples from your own life. Sometimes I do fail in a sermon because I dare greatly, as Brene Brown puts it, and jump headfirst into a topic or theme that just turns out to be more than I can handle, and I can't quite pull it all together and make it work. That's a brave failure. I had the courage, I just couldn't quite manage it. But more often, I fail in my attempt to write a good sermon because although I may be passionately convicted about what I want to say, I don't quite have the courage to put my whole self in, to dare greatly, to take the risks involved in being wholehearted. Instead of embracing the vulnerability of that, I put it off, or I stay on the surface and avoid the deep thinking, and the result is something shallow. Maybe you've had experiences like that. Something that you cared a lot about but were afraid to give yourself to fully enough to do it really well. Sometimes the courage we need is the courage to jump in with both feet. But there have also been times when I have failed in my attempt to write a good sermon because I didn't really believe in what I was trying to say, or I didn't care enough about the subject to give it the depth it deserved, and I tried to push a sermon out anyway. And maybe you've had experiences like that too, doing something that you didn't really care deeply about, but out of obligation or habit or other people's expectations, you felt you had to do it anyway. That doesn't usually lead to great results either. But in that case, then, we need a different kind of courage. Not the courage to get up and try harder, but the courage to say, no, I'm not going to do this. This is the wrong subject. This is the wrong project. I'm not going to write that sermon. Because, yeah, it's great to have the courage to try again, but it also takes courage to refuse to try again, to admit that we failed because we're trying to do something that isn't really what we ought to be doing. Parker Palmer quotes a poem by William Stafford that asks, "Ask me whether what I have done is my life." And then Palmer talks about having the courage to look at our lives and say, no, this is not my life. Sometimes we need the courage to stop trying to live the wrong life, to do the wrong project, to invest in the wrong things. Which then leads me to one more kind of courage we might need. Because once we find the courage to say no to what is not our life, to choose not to try again, then we need the courage to figure out just what it is we should be doing or being instead. To go back to my sermon metaphor, if I'm trying to write the wrong sermon and just trying harder isn't going to help because my heart's not in it, then I need to consider instead just what I really should be preaching. What am I called to say? So I've come to see that accepting and confronting and understanding failure calls for many different kinds of courage. And all of that then led me to one more question. Where does that courage come from? Whether it's the courage to be all in, to dare greatly, or the courage to face my failure and confront my own vulnerability, the courage to try again, or the courage to say, no, I won't try again, I need a new path, and then the courage to embrace that new path. Where does that courage come from? And I'm going to leave you with that question. It's not a question I can answer for you because the answer is different for each of us. But I think it's a profoundly spiritual question, and I think it really comes down to what I would call faith. And here I'm indebted to William Sloane Coffin, who describes faith as trusting without reservation, not believing without proof, but trusting without reservation. Where do we put our deepest trust? Because I think that's where our courage comes from. I think of my Mennonite friend who finds her courage in her absolute trust that Jesus is walking beside her. My help comes from the Lord, she says, and she can be brave because she absolutely knows she is never alone. I think of my Buddhist friend whose meditation practice keeps him grounded in the goodness of his own nature and his trust in the essential goodness that surrounds and holds him. He can sit with painful emotions because he is so much at peace with himself that they don't overwhelm him. I think of a quotation a friend reminded me of recently from Anne Frank's diary. I believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. Her courage, I think, came from a deep humanism that was stronger than any evidence of human hatred. So what about you? Where do you find your courage? If we're going to learn to face our failures and keep growing, whether on a personal, individual level, or on a communal or institutional or national or global level, we need communities and spiritual practices that ground us. And I believe this is a place where that happens. I feel that in some of the words we've sung this morning. Open our eyes to see that life abounds. Open hearts to welcome it among us. The light of love here shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home. And then that beautiful, beautiful meditation. There is a love holding us. There is a love holding all we love. There is a love holding all. We rest in this love. Communities like this, where we can connect and support and encourage each other, are great sources of courage. Places where we can strengthen each other to face our failures, to tap into the sources of our courage, and then to bring our renewed sense of possibility to bear on the world around us. It may look different for each of us, but we can support each other in finding those practices and finding our way forward. May it be so.
This morning, Reverend Libby has asked us to reflect on times in our lives when we felt failure and the challenge of picking ourselves up to continue on. Looking back over my lifespan, I can say that my most difficult time was back in the 1980s when I went to work in the Delaware governor's office as Governor Castle's education advisor. Much about that experience was exciting and challenging in a good way. Governor Castle was very clear about the need to breathe new life into the education establishment. Test scores were stagnant, and educators were doing what they'd always been doing, and they were just fine, thank you. I found several national organizations ready to partner with us and eventually engaged with them, involving Delaware educators in some of the most exciting work we had ever done. But quickly, I encountered several roadblocks in my own shop. Very negative attitudes about teachers not valuing their work, and a mismatch of what the office colleagues seemed to expect and the work I was doing. Yes, it sure felt like failure. I offer this reflection because of the importance this church community was to me during this time. I had a husband at home who believed in me and supported what I was doing, and each Sunday I came to this church to be refueled. I came here to be with people who embraced the values of equity, of justice, of compassion in human relations. I would come to church feeling defeated and walk out feeling rejuvenated. Perhaps some of you have had similar feelings of replenishment from a Sunday morning experience or from your volunteer work, just as I later did that decade when I took on being president of First Unitarian's Board of Trustees. Again, a wonderful way to feel success when the alternate world of work was a struggle. So here's to seizing opportunities and savoring the work when our values match up. Reflect on your experiences, how your being a part of this church has enriched your life. This stewardship moment is the time during our service when we offer our treasure, resources to support the work of the staff, to keep the lights on, and to the work going forward. During the offertory, the 4 ways to give slide will appear on your screen at home, and those of you here in the sanctuary are invited to put cash or check in the white offering baskets in the back. Now let us dedicate our offering. Please join me. To the work of this congregation, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action, we dedicate our lives and these our offerings.
Our wish for you as now we part is for greater peace to fill your heart with dreams as vast as starry space, so hurt and anger know no place. May truth be shared and wounds be healed, and joy for living be revealed through every fate and circumstance. May hope lead weary steps to dance, and may your life be as a song, resounding with the dawn to steal awake the night and softly serenade the stars, ever dancing circles in the night. May fears be turned with keen insight to wisdom for what's just and right. Where sorrow grows, compassion strong, and pains will pass before too long. May the bounds of our diversity serve a richer harmony. May courage hold your heart so true to smile on love when it smiles on you. and softly serenade the stars, ever dancing circles in the night, ever dancing circles in the
Thank you, Rebecca and Kathy. If you lit a chalice at home, I invite you to extinguish it as I read these words adapted from This is the Message of Our Faith by Maureen Killeran, who's a UU minister who served 7 UU congregations over the past 30 years. She says, "This is the message of our faith, to act with passion in the face of injustice, to love with courage in the midst, to love with courage in the midst of life's pain. This is the meaning of our chalice flame. May it empower our hearts until we are together again."
Following the benediction, we will sing our closing hymn, number 1020 in the Teal hymnal, and the words will also appear on the screen. And then we conclude the service by greeting one another here in this room and then joining in the parish hall for a time for fellowship and refreshments. Now, these words of benediction from Andrew Pakula. As you prepare to leave this sacred space, pack away a piece of this church in your heart. Wrap it carefully like a precious gem. Carry it with you through the joys and sorrows of your days. Let its gentle glow strengthen you, warm you, remind you of all that is good and true, until you gather here again in this place of love. And now let's sing together in number 1020, Wo Ya Ya.
It will be hard, we know.